in my book I argue that before the coming of missionaries, the Zulu and many other African peoples had no sense of God. And the question is often asked, surely all people have a sense of God? This is a very contentious issue. And you'll find many books that argue that all people have a sense of God, that all Africans had a sense of God. And in particular, a lot of Africans get offended by arguing this way, because in the 19th century, strangely enough, it was the anthropologists that argued that Africans didn't have a sense of God. And the reason they argued this wasn't because of empirical research, but rather it was because they had a preordained Darwinian theory of human development. And therefore, by arguing that Africans had no sense of God, they showed that they were lower on the evolutionary scale. Now, even earlier than that, you had a lot of people who argued that Africans had no sense of God as a way of justifying slavery. Because if Africans didn't have a sense of God, then surely you could enslave them because they weren't truly human. All humans have a sense of God, therefore these are a people without a sense of God, therefore they're not human. This, I think, has really confused the study of African religion. Because when I argue that the missionaries discovered that Africans didn't have a sense of God, or rather when I argue that the evidence suggests that the Zulu did not have an idea of God in the early 19th century, this is based upon the recorded interviews with Zulus and other writings of various missionaries that went to Zululand. Now, many of these people said that, well, they don't have a sense of God now, but surely they had a sense of God in the past. And we've arrived just as they're losing their sense of God. This was a common argument. And so the idea that Africans always have a sense of God crept into the debate, because in the back of the minds of the missionaries was this idea of justifying slavery, which they were strongly opposed to. And also later on in the century of opposing the anthropological work that people were putting out, which were what in the 19th century used to be called armchair anthropologists. These were people who essentially read the reports of missionaries and then used them to speculate about human development. But the evidence is very clear that certainly among the Zulu, the missionaries encountered a situation where the Africans just did not seem to have any sense of God. And it's not only the missionaries, it's the early writers from the 1820s on. One gets people like Nathaniel Isaacs, who was actually a trader and who was Jewish, so he wasn't a missionary. And you get another man called Finn, who actually married about 20 Zulu wives. And also he records that the Zulu didn't have a sense of God. He was another of the traders. Now, what does this mean? And in my book, I argue that really the Zulu society was not backward at all. Technologically, it wasn't as advanced as the European societies. And the Zulus quickly recognized that and tried to copy it. But what it was that they were a secular society, that they'd become basically secular in their approach to the world. And they were very practical in their secularity. Now, when one gets the missionaries arriving, people like Alan Gardner, who was a former sea captain who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and was converted after a major battle with the French. And during that battle, he prayed if he survived, he would devote his life to God. And he became a missionary to the Zulu. And he was a very shrewd man and talked to the Zulu king and to other Zulus and had a very high opinion of them. In fact, he thought that the Zulu were more intelligent and adept at facing the situation they faced in terms of adapting to the world they were living in than the working classes in England. That he would much prefer the Zulu in terms of intelligence to the average English worker. So this isn't putting the Zulu down at all, but his evidence suggests that there was not this sense of God. It was a secular society. And therefore one's got to ask, what type of religion did this essentially secular society have to the extent it had religious beliefs? And what we find is that there was a veneration of the ancestors and that there were beliefs in things like witchcraft. But these were very practical beliefs. One's got to view witchcraft. Witchcraft is a complicated topic because we always think of European witches. But among the Zulu, witchcraft was an explanation for illness. and why people are sick, why people suffer, why tragedies happen. For example, why does a hut burn down when other huts don't burn down? What causes that? And it's always caused by some sort of human agency, which is attributed to witchcraft. So the Zulu were very practical in their approach to the supernatural. They believed in the supernatural, but they didn't have an idea of a high God, or at least all of the evidence suggests that. Now, this sort of finding holds good for many African groups, right up to Uganda and the Baganda. They are in a very similar position. In fact, their beliefs are very similar to the Zulu. In West Africa, it's less true. And there was much more of a belief in God in West African societies. But when one's dealing with African society, I think you've got to be very careful, and one's got to look at the evidence. Some societies were very religious, and they had a high God. Some had many gods. And a large number appear to have had no real belief or real practical belief in a high God. So they didn't effectively believe in God. They had ancestors, they had other things. So it's a different type of society we're dealing with, but this doesn't make it any less good as a society. It's not a backward society. They were, in fact, quite advanced. And one of the ways they see this, when the traders first went in the 1820s to Zululand, the Zulu blacksmiths were very good, and they very quickly learned how to make muskets. So they could copy the European guns of the time and make them. Within about 20 years, that was no longer true, because European technology had advanced to such a degree that the rifle had become common, and the African blacksmith with the tools available to them couldn't make rifles. And then shortly after that, the machine gun came along, and that gave Europeans complete dominance. And it's only really that from about 1850, 1860 onwards, that you begin to get what we'd recognize today as racism among some of the missionaries going out. And there's no doubt some of the missionaries were influenced by a tinge of racism. But this racism is very much bound up with Darwinism and technological advance. The majority of missionaries, though, I would argue, were not racist, were very strongly opposed to racism. And for that reason, many of them said, of course the Africans believe in God. They've got just as good a religious sentiment as we have. And the religious sentiment, I think, is true. But the actual belief as to whether there is a God behind everything who created everything just doesn't seem to be there. And we don't have any difficulty when scholars and others write about the Buddhists. The Buddhists did not believe in God. They rejected a belief in God. Contrary to what many early scholars about Buddhism wrote, the Buddhists were at the same time very interested in the supernatural. They had a supernatural world, but they didn't have God as a central part of their religion. So to say the Zulu didn't believe in God is very similar to saying that their society was very similar to Buddhist society. In fact, I think if Chinese expansion had continued in the 15th and 16th century, at a time when they were exploring the world, before China closed itself off to the world, if they had reached Africa, they did reach Africa, but if they had started exploration of Africa and met with African groups, we might have had the development of a very different type of society in Africa, much more Confucian, much more Buddhist, and I think that would have fitted very well with traditional African beliefs.